and welcome to a new series which I am going to be starting called Brochure Wednesday. Now, I have a number of brochures for various different things, cars, electronics, etc. And I thought it would be a nice idea to show you lucky people, the viewers, what I have brochure-wise, and have a little chat about some of the things that the brochures represent, or the brochures are advertising. In this first instance, we're going to be looking at this, which falls onto the desk, which is my Motorcraft thermometer, which I've just put back up where it's supposed to live. But what we are going to be looking at initially, if I just move a couple of things around so I don't have another collapse of things on the shelf, is this brochure for the Rover SD1. And this particular brochure, the Rover SD1, was known initially as the Rover 3500. You also had the Rover 2000, which came later, the Rover 2300 and the Rover 2600, which came fairly soon after, a couple of years, about a year or so after the Rover 3500. So called because it had the 3.5 litre V8, all aluminium V8, originally a Buick unit, and bought from General Motors back in the 60s, I believe. First home for the V8 was the Rover P5B, which had originally had a 3 litre unit, and the V8 actually transformed that car. The engine itself saw service in many different vehicles over the years. Eventually it grew to 4.6 litres in size. I'm not sure of the exact capacity, and arguably the last vehicle that it saw service in was the P38A Range Rover, or the last official large-scale production vehicle. There were examples of the engine that were 5.2 litres in size, but the 3.5 litre was probably the most common size that was used. That did grow to 3.9 litres, but 3.5 litres was certainly the most common, and arguably, to be honest with you, the most reliable. The engine itself became a V6 in the MG 6R4, the MG Metro 6R4, literally by just chopping off a couple of cylinders and adding a 24 valve head, or 24 valve heads rather, so 4 valves per cylinder, 3 cylinders on each bank. There was a 2 valve per head arrangement, which was literally just a pair of the original SD1, the original 3500 cylinder heads just cut down, so you had 3 instead of 4, and that did see some sort of pre-production service. And yeah, quite an interesting engine, quite a lot of interesting stories about it as well. Certainly sort of regards quality control, how there was a lot of loss of castings with the original engines due to problems with the production line, sharp edges actually trashing entire blocks. There's a whole video on YouTube somewhere about this, which is to do with circle of quality within British Leyland, and there was a quality control team that went around all the production lines, identified problems with production, snagging points, etc. One of those being sharp edges on the conveyor belt lines, and with those edges, literally just sort of applying some rubber to these edges, they managed to cut the number of trashed blocks on the V8 production line substantially. So there was far less wastage and far greater production and profit, ultimately. This particular brochure originally saw service for the White Tree Garage in Northumbria Drive in Henleys in Bristol. If you know Bristol, Henleys is between, I think, Southmead and Westbury-on-Trim, if I remember rightly. It's not in the centre of Bristol. It's sort of over from Clifton a bit, I think, say north of Clifton. Quite a nice area, quite well to do these days. And yeah, obviously at some point there was probably some Rover garage there. So let's start off and get into the brochure itself. And the first thing that we have is we've got this rather nice postcard. Today, tomorrow, the new Rover 3500. This yellow was actually quite a popular colour that a lot of them came in, I would imagine, because it was on this particular postcard. So this was not an original postcard. It looks like this was from 2005, a reproduction, but that was quite a popular colour that you did see them in back in the day. On this side we've got a nice profile view of the SD1, and over this side, I don't know if it catches up on camera, but you have this sort of embossed Rover logo, the Viking longship, which is quite nice. SD1, if you know your Rover internal product codes, stands for Specialist Division 1. The SD1 was this, obviously the Rover 3500. The SD2 was a, didn't go into production, but it was this sort of Triumph TR7 type hatchback four-seater thing. And the SD3 was the Honda Ballard based Rover 213, which later became the Rover 213 and 216 when Rover introduced the S-Series four-cylinder. The original version was basically a Honda Ballard, used the same engine as the Triumph Acclaim, which was the very reliable and very well built Honda 1.3 litre unit. And it was Rover's sort of first entry into the smaller market, and was really sort of the beginning of the Rover brand becoming basically the entire brand that you see and know about today. Sort of basically covering a range of vehicles from small to large. So this is a rather nice one. We've got the frontal view here of this Series 1 SD1. One thing that was quite unique about the SD1 at the time was the bonded windscreen. That was one of the main reasons for warranty calls, because the bonded windscreen would leak ultimately. And they also had a brand new paint process. Later P6s were also party to that process, or were effectively tested with that process, and they would often go out onto the market and they would ultimately come back because the paint was falling off in large chunks and they would have to be repainted. The problem was quickly sorted, but it was one of those things that sort of damaged this sort of pioneering car's reputation early on, as a lot of British Leyland products, niggly build quality issues. Things that should have been discovered during testing, but were not discovered until they went into production. These wheels, actually, were very reminiscent of the ones found on the original Rover P8 concept, and they seem to have made their way onto the SD1. Another unique feature for the time was you had an executive car that was a hatchback, and that was really odd for the time. But you saw a lot of manufacturers go that way. Renault, Renault already had the 20 and 30, which were hatchbacks. Later, the Renault 25 was available as a hatchback. After the Mark II Ford Granada, Ford produced the Mark III Granada, which was originally only available as a hatchback, later as a saloon, but it really sort of paved the way for a lot of executive cars of the time, going for this sort of unique, brand new hatchback arrangement, which was very practical, and when sort of coupled with the SD1's styling, very elegant as well, especially with the headlight treatment, which is reminiscent of the Ferrari Daytona, and the shape of the actual body itself, which is, I'd say, reminiscent of the Maserati Indy. So quite a nice picture here, quite a nice lakeside scene. very nice bit of photography actually. Really shows the car's attributes very nicely, and especially with the choice of the metallic silver. Come on to the text side, let's have a look at the text. It tells us what we have here. So it actually tells us a bit about the engine, the fact that the world famous aluminium Rover V8 engine, uprated from 143 model brake horsepower in the previous 3500, so that would have been in the P6, to 155 in the new model. Yet fuel economy is improved and the smoothness, silence and instant response are as superb as ever. So these engines were torquey. They didn't necessarily produce blistering brake horsepower figures, but they were very torquey, which is why they saw service in the original Range Rover. It was the ideal engine for that particular car. And at the time, when fuel wasn't such a concern, although this was released in the midst of the fuel crisis, a small capacity V8 was just the thing for an executive car, especially one that was as light as the 3.5 litre unit in the SD1. The interior was something of I want to say a bone of contention, because it was making use of some of the latest materials available at the time, such as the velour, nylons, plastics, and this particular sort of mustard trim was quite popular in this particular model, and it was just sort of a very nice modern interior. Series 2 cars actually had a return to some of the more traditional features, such as the wooden trim on the doors, etc. And if the Jaguar XJ40 had been released when it should have been, which would have been sometime in the 1970s, sort of mid to late 70s, it would have had an interior probably very similar to this with no wood trim. In fact, the original XJS didn't have any wood trim. It was sort of by customer demand and market demand that wood trim was reintroduced. Probably the same deal with the SD1. Later models had far more wood, far less plastic, and options of leather, etc. Although you could get leather trim on the early versions as well. Another very unique feature was this pod instrument cluster. This literally meant that you could move the pod from here over to here for left-hand drive models. This little vent here would make way for the steering column, and there's a tiny little vent there which you can see here in the instrument cluster, which was your driver's side air vent. I think if you actually remove this, you could actually see the plug-in for all of the wiring for the instrument cluster. Funnily enough, this styling innovation, which I think was a David Bach innovation, saw light in the original the original Mini Metro, which was restyled by Bach. It also saw service in the original Land Rover Freelander, the Freelander 1. So you had like an instrument pod on this side, you had electric mirror controls there, but on this side, on the passenger side, you had a blank where the mirror controls would go, and you had either an airbag or a deep cubby hole where obviously the instrument cluster would go. So this styling was not only futuristic but also very productive, very practical for production, switching from right to left-hand drive. It meant you didn't have to have separate dashboard mouldings, and I think the only thing that was different was the pod changed so that the auxiliary gauges were on that side rather than there, which is sort of ideal for the right-hand drive market. Full instrumentation, rev counter, speedometer, oil, pressure, water temperature, battery charge and fuel level. And obviously options of either 5-speed manual, I think it was 5-speed, yeah, 5-speed manual, or this 3-speed automatic, which I think was a Borg-Warner unit. Feel free to correct me on that, but I think, inverted commas, it was on early ones a Borg-Warner. So, next page. Sort of focusing more on some of the detail features of the car itself. Interestingly, the heating and ventilation appears to have a recirculation control. Usually that's something you saw on Japanese designs, mainly because a lot of Japanese cars were available in the native market with air conditioning. So it's quite interesting to see it on a non-air conditioned car, but quite a useful feature. And also probably there because you could get these models with, I think you certainly later on you could get them with air conditioning as an option. Other little features, you had the vanity light there on the passenger side under the air vent just above the glove box, which is a very useful feature. The large rear load bay had the covering there, also available in this absolutely stunning metallic blue. Rear seats would go down, giving you really very spacious accommodation, and obviously spare wheel located underneath the boot floor as well. There were a couple of estate models produced. There is one in the Haynes Motor Museum, well it certainly was the last time I checked, and there is one at the British Heritage Museum up in Gaydon. I think the one in the Heritage Museum is the better of the two, because there were differences between the two. And the estate models were really good, actually. They looked fantastic, and it's a shame that they didn't make it into production, because they would have given the Volvo 240 and 260 series at the time a real run for the money. Also focusing now on technological aspects, halogen headlights, the integrated rear cluster of lights there with, I think, integrated fog lights and reversing lights. Also talking about the dual line hydraulic braking system, so a bit of a focus on safety. Focusing here on the V8 engine, as you can see, with its twin SU carburetors. Later ones had a Lucas hot wires system. Or did they? No, they had... Oh, hang on a minute. They had this sort of weird sort of Bosch L-Jet Lucas hybrid. I can't remember exactly what it was, but they did have fuel injection that was sort of Bosch L-Jetronic, and a popular modification at the time was, well, not at the time, but sort of a few years later, was apparently airflow meter from a 4.2 litre Series 3 Jag and a higher lift cam, and that would sort of unleash some of the hidden performance within this engine. There was a lot of hidden performance within these units, and a lot of things you could do with them. Simple things really, such as improved lift camshafts, different carburetors, etc. Certainly the biggest, most sort of powerful SD1 was obviously the twin plenum, which didn't necessarily increase brake horsepower, but did increase the amount of torque, because you had obviously two throttle bodies on the plenum assembly. Options included these rather nice alloy wheels. Those were available on earlier models, especially the 3500S, which was a short-lived performance model. Also, other interesting features were safety features were the Dunlop De Novo run flat tyres, power operated windows, and special cast road wheels with 195/70 tyres. Unipart accessories, you can also obtain child safety seat fitting kits and many other items to personalise this very personable car. But this was a big thing, certainly, the windscreen. The fact that it was laminated, that was a very big thing. The fact that it was bonded meant that it was incredibly strong, but also bonded windscreens tend to make up a certain degree of the strength of the car as well. This was really sort of the first use of bonded windscreens, and as I said earlier, wasn't without its problems. Also, sort of signs of the times, you had ashtrays on each door, and actually another feature which I haven't mentioned because it's a little bit boring but interesting nonetheless, is warm air was ducted down the... let's get a picture if we can see it. Warm air was ducted down the sills. So you would very rarely see an SD1 with sill rot, because warm air was ducted down the sills to vents for the rear passenger compartment, so the sills were kept dry because of air basically constantly blowing down there, you would tend to get rot at the rear closing panel on the sills, and I believe rear arches, front inner wings, doors, etc. But really, you know, one of the main areas where cars tended to rot at the time, the sills, these were largely immune to that. And it's a wonder why other manufacturers don't do it, because the sill is an ideal cavity to run warm air down, really. Coming through to the last series of pages now, we have the specification. So obviously we've got a lot more specifications in here, mainly sort of tech specs that you don't really see in brochures these days. I mean, who wants to know that the clutch uses a 9.5-inch diaphragm plate single drive plate? I do, because I'm that way inclined, but the average buyer these days wouldn't not want to know that. I mean, who wants to know what the final drive ratio is? I do, again, because that's the way I am, the way I think. But, you know, you don't see this sort of comprehensive information in a modern brochure, especially with the thing with gear ratios. I mean, who wants to see that? I do, as I keep saying, but again, the average buyer doesn't. Mainly the sort of things you have in brochures these days is, well, sort of how fast it goes and how economical it is. That's, you know, that's the numbers that seem to sell. Not for the fact that it's got a 9.5-inch diaphragm single plate dry clutch. Woohoo! Coming through to the end, we've got the Leyland Cars Super Cover option, which was a warranty package that was available across the Leyland range at the time. And a few other sort of little bits and pieces here. Quite a nice bit on these of internal dimensions of the car. That's astonishing. It gives you front seat cushion width. Absolutely amazing. Again, you just don't see this in modern brochures now. A lot of this stuff you only sort of find in technical documents. But yeah, really comprehensive. And final page is this. Production number 3207/A. And there we go. That is the end of that particular brochure. And we'll just put that there, because that's a nice thing to finish on. And thumbnail shot. Anyway, if you have enjoyed the video today, don't forget to hit the like button, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thank you for watching.